So our first panel of the afternoon is political and economic integration in Mexico and the United States. And we have three wonderful presenters. We have Juan Herrera from UCLA, Arely Zimmerman from Pomona College, and Rodolfo Casillas from Flaxo in Mexico City. So we're going to start with Juan Herrera, 20 minutes, Juan.
20 minutes.
And we'll leave the questions for the end of the panel, okay? Thank you. Take it away, Juan.
Hi, everyone. I probably will be shorter than 20 minutes, hopefully. It's such an honor to be with you all. I'm a little nervous because it's such an intimate crowd. I know so many people here, so it's a little weird. It's not just 18 and 19-year-olds that I'm lecturing to. But I was also a little nervous when I got invited to be part of this conference, this amazing gathering that I'm so honored to be with. I was a little scared, y'all. And I have a confession to make. I'm a closeted Guatemalan. Yes, it's shocking to you all because I am a queer man, so I exude queerness, right? It's like a rainbow. So me in the closet, we're not cool anymore, but I am a closeted Guatemalan. To most people, I'm a geographer. And we all know there are not that many geographers of color out there. And when there are Latinx geographers, they tend to be Mexican American or Chicano, right? And I have published one article a long time ago in 2016 on Guatemalan experiences of migrants that I'm going to talk about later, in which I did out myself as a fellow Guatemalan. But I am principally a scholar of social movements and geography more specifically, and I do work on nothing more than the frickin' Chicano movement, y'all. I know, that's my closet. It just closets me in. Shocking to know a Guatemalan who is writing a book about the Chicano movement. And most of the time, I just let people assume that I'm Chicano, not because I'm ashamed of being Guatemalan, but, you know, I hate going into long explanations, and we as professors already do a lot of free labor. So So now on this panel on economic and political integration, I wanted to offer you some thoughts on how I have experienced integration, because I'm not a sociologist or a political scientist. So, but I think that fundamentally integration for me is a spatial process. So meaning that integration is a process that happens through interactions in and through space, right? And interactions that create space. So me being a closeted Guatemalan is not an accident. You see, I grew up being super Guatemalan. My immigrant family was very insular, and my mom made sure that I had my weekly dose of pepián to remind me that I was Chapin, right? And we always went to our favorite bakery and restaurant called La Guatemalteca that we still go to today on a regular basis, right? But when I stepped onto the campus at UCLA back in 2000 when I was a little undergrad, you know, I was immediately labeled as Mexican or Chicano. And guess what? In the sea of Eurocentrism and whiteness that is UCLA, I found this thing called Chicano Studies. I also found a freshman summer program and a program called the Academic Advancement Program that was primarily built by Chicanos and prior generations of Latinx scholars at the university. I also experienced this thing called diversity and inclusion, a butchering of important demands made by civil rights and freedom struggles waged by Black and Latinx populations before me. And let me tell you, those Latinx populations were predominantly of Mexican descent. And though this foreign thing that I found called Chicano Studies, and through this thing called Chicano Studies, I learned to be involved in my community, to be politically active, and I also learned to reevaluate my indigenous roots. Again, for me, integration is a social process, meaning that integration is a process of interactions that happens in and through space. And that means that it happens by relating to others and to the sedimentation of power relations and histories in space. Well, what does that mean? I learned in my Chicano Studies classes that being of indigenous descent was nothing to be ashamed of. despite the fact that most adults in my family would say, and still say, this really derogatory term, no seas indio, or don't be Indian, to be told not to do something backward, right? I learned to be proud of my indigenous ancestry and to think critically about what it meant to be mixed, or Ladino, as most Guatemalans would call me, right? From Chicano studies, from Chicanos, I learned that being mestizo does not mean being non-indigenous. It is about being a combination. And for Chicano movement activists, this idea of being mestizo was a way to claim their own identity vis-a-vis Americanization or whitening, right? Which made me question my own family's racist anti-indigenous sentiments. It also helped me to start thinking about how I could be an ally, right? In this situation, and learning through women of color feminists like Audre Lorde, Shiri Moraga, and Gloria Anzaldúa was really learning to be relational, right? And how do you navigate difference in various ways? So when I began my PhD, this is kind of becoming a personal history, I'm sorry, but I'll get to a point right now, sorry. Yeah. So when I began my PhD in ethnic studies, I sought to study Guatemalan migration and integration in the Bay Area. And I found out that most of the recently arrived Guatemalan immigrants were day laborers. So I began to work closely with a day labor population. And I wrote this article in response, and I started to write an article in response to a lot of beef that I had with the then growing literature on quote unquote informal laborers and day laborers, which I felt that this literature was really treating, and also popular conceptions on TV that were describing day laborers. It was so common to hear them be described as these transient, despatialized laborers, right? These people that are merely workers, right? And we can only study them if they're on the street waiting for work, or if they are encountering conditions of worker inequality, right, et cetera, right? So this realization, this kind of beef with this tendency to view these day laborers as these despatialized folks, right, brought me back to some of the foundational work that I did in ethnic studies in thinking about Black intellectual traditions and Black political thought. And I became inspired, especially now as a geographer. I'm also a geographer now. I became inspired by Black geographies, the really incredible work in Black geographies. I encourage you all to really, it's this like amazing field of scholarship that's quite recent now. And it sort of thinks about the role of anti-Black racism in structuring and understanding of Black people as aspatial or ungeographic, right? And I look at the work of Catherine McKittrick. She wrote this amazing book called Demonic Grounds. And so really thinking about how there's these legacies of the transatlantic slave trade, right? And this idea that certain kinds of humans are only made for laboring practices, and they are essentially placeless, right? Or ungeographic, as she says. So I became, because again, for me, integration is about coming to embody a particular place, right? And relationships with other human beings, it means that a lot of the workers that I was interacting as day laborers were also being treated as these placeless people, right? These kinds of exploitable and therefore tractable, and again, aspatial. So under capitalist regimes, and especially in our current neoliberal political economy, migrants are valued solely for their cheap labor without adequately perceiving them as human beings who construct social relationships that produce space. So I went in to study what are the placemaking practices, right, of day laborers. And so, let me see, I wrote this article, and you can find it in Latino Studies. It's quite old now, because I remember I'm in prison by the Chicano movement right now to finish my book. It's a good thing. But so I came up with this concept called racialized illegality, in which I was really struck by the fact that day laborers, especially those that come from Guatemala who are mainly indigenous, right, were experiencing the same kind of anti-indigenous racism that I learned in my own family and that I see very prominently amongst Guatemalans and amongst other Latin American groups, right? And so I came to to this study and thinking about, again, integration and thinking about how we need to study illegality as it intersects with other modes of difference. So I was talking about how unauthorized immigrants experience illegality differently based on how they were initially racialized in their home country, right? And this ultimately affects their migration and settlement processes. I also was trying to bring into focus more of this diversity in Latin America, racial diversity in Latin America, right? We often just get subsumed into one category. And I wanted to sort of unsettle these dominant analyses of illegalities that usually compress the diversity of Latin American immigration into a singular Latino experience. And so what I ended up coming to tell in this article is really a story of racial violence through space, right? And it became a story about the suffering of these individuals, right? And this is a picture of the non-indigenous parada where mainly all the Mexican mestizos and non-indigenous Guatemalans lived. And this is the indigenous parada. You can see it's a little bit more run down, et cetera. So I looked at how, because of anti-indigenous racism, these workers utilize space as a form of segregation, right? To segregate themselves and create wage hierarchies, et cetera. But I recall, I came back and I was like, wait, I'm still telling this kind of same story that I didn't want to tell about suffering. And mainly it's because I'm reminded again by Black geographers like Catherine McKittrick, who really says, look, we should, and we as intellectuals especially, right? We need to write about this violence and this suffering, right? It's our duty to expose that this inequality is happening, right? But she says, speaking about the African diaspora, right? She says, how do we do so? How do we account for this violence without overtaxing the suffering Black body? And so for me, because of this relational thinking, right, and then we as Central Americans now live in a place that's sort of already sedimented with the power relationships set in place by the transatlantic slave trade, et cetera, right? I really wanted to tell an alternative story based on the same data, right? It was the same data. I had hung out with the same people in the same community. So I wanted to tell a different story that did something quite different. Which was about how these people, hold on one second, I'm gonna, how these people also made alternative notions of space. And this is where I'm going to read here again. I'm moved by McKittrick's assertion that instead of exclusively focusing on the geographies of dominations produced through racism, we can also think about how our, quote, our racial past can uncover a collective history of encounter, a difficult interrelatedness that promises an ethical analytics of race, not on suffering, but on human life. So again, I had written this article that had done this job of overtaxing the suffering brown body, right, and the suffering indigenous brown body, and I sought to rewrite it, or I'm still rethinking it, right? And part of it came back to like, actually, this took place in the same community that I am writing a book about based on the Chicano movement. So it brought me back to Chicano movement activism, and sorry. So Chicano movement activism, right? And because if we think spatially, we think that these spaces where the day laborers that I interacted with, right, did suffer because of racism, they also experience a certain kind of conjecture of social relationships that had already been shaped by previous social movements. And so what I came to find out, and what I'm writing now as another article, is how sort of these indigenous migrants, right, that I characterize as almost solely suffering in that article, actually came to inhabit a place that was already imbued with some of the activism from the Chicano movement, and it happened through institutions. And so I look now at how so many institutions that were shaped out of the Chicano movement activism and have since been influenced by this activism, how they provide these very critical social services for a lot of these immigrants, right? That are being helped in various ways, are building community, are making space. And so this is a picture that I took from my work with Street Level Health Project, which was a free health clinic that was trying to provide health services and other services for day laborers, right? And this is just a picture of the concentration of social services in the neighborhood of Fruitvale in Oakland, where I conducted this research. And so what it shows is that there was already, because of this history of social movement activism, right, that these day laborers were already coming into a place that had existing services. And guess what? These existing services moved to really help them and to help to create a sense of community and to sort of integrate them into a project of social justice as well. So I worked with Street Level Health Project, and I learned how somebody who's of Peruvian descent, Laura Lopez, who was then the executive director, and now Gabriela Galicia, who is a Chicana, who's now the executive director of Street Level, and Kathy Ahoy, who is a public health nurse, who is a refugee from India and was inspired by the farm workers movement, how they are helping to produce a really broad range of services that now we have different kinds of interpreters for Mam-speaking indigenous migrants. Don Francisco on the left is one of the interpreters. There's now also part of helping for the immigrant rights activism that they're doing. And Maria Valencia is now, she is now involved as the official Mam interpreter. So what I mean to say is that when we focus on integration, and I'm going to sort of end with this, I think we really need to think about how as Central American populations, we come to interact relationally with other groups, right? And we come to interact with the legacies, not just the negative legacies of like the transatlantic slave trade, but we also come to interact with the legacies of social movement activism in a long genealogy of Black and Latinx freedom struggles, right? And so my concluding remarks would be that this is also a very, as I said, it's a very personal story for me because my dad was a day laborer when he first came to the United States. And my mom was also one of these sort of unskilled workers that, well, she actually raised a child, right? So I think there's a lot of skill to that as a live-in nanny. I don't think I could still raise a child, but yet. So, but these were, like my dad, informal workers who were, I think, in most of scholarly literature, we tend to think about them as these despatialized, transient workers that at best labor at somebody's house, et cetera, or stand in a street corner. But you know what? My mom and dad, they raised a family here. And our family also served as a hub to bring about all of our family from Guatemala. They now live in what I call the Herrera compound. They basically took over a building, right? And guess what? They now live in Van Nuys, which is now increasingly Central American, and they interact with Mexican populations. The panaderia that's like a Mexican panaderia now sells Central American bread. So my case, what I'm trying to argue is that we need to think relationally. And for me, I wouldn't be here today if it hadn't been for the amazing mentorship of somebody like Lacey Abrego or Cecilia Menjivar, who paved the ways. And guess what? They're not Guatemalan, they're Salvadoran, right? And so I think we need to think about Central Americans in this relational fashion, and not just amongst ourselves, right? How do we relate within Guatemalans, right? But also between different Central American groups, and how do we also come to occupy the same space, and how are we going to then learn from each other and learn from past movements and past forms of suffering as well, so that we can imagine better futures together. So I think that's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juan. We now move to Arely Zimmerman's presentation. Arely's here from Pomona College, so thank you, Arely.
It's hard to follow that up. Why isn't this working?
I think we have to tell them too.
No, yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's gonna work. There you go. Buenas tardes, good afternoon. I want to just thank, just want to really thank the organizers of this conference and for having me. The amount of work that something like this takes, and I was just telling some colleagues that the Claremont colleges, we have a little bit of a smaller scale. So speaking to this audience for UC folks is like, oh, this is a small crowd. For me, it's pretty intimidating. And I also promise you that I haven't coordinated with Juan on my talk. We did not coordinate. This is not a duet. But strangely enough, I mean, I guess, this is what's cool about, being Central American scholars, right? In terms of our intellectual formation and how we think about things and how our identities really inform, our work. So the title of my talk today is Banana Republicanism. It's probably not what you think. I'm not talking about Trump, basically. Racial scripts, Latinx solidarity, and immigrant rights in the age of Trump. And I was inspired when I got the invitation to put together a talk, a little bit risky, because it's really, these ideas are really, I'm workshopping them with you. What better crowd to do that with, or audience? But what I really was motivated and inspired by was wanting to respond. We see public discourse and the racialization of Central Americans in our public discourse. And I think it is a call for us to respond, right? And to not only to respond, but to really think critically about what tools we have to understand and to analyze. Because we all talk about it, right? Oh, the racialization, the criminalization. But these are the important spaces and moments in which to reflect critically on what that, what the genealogy of that discourse is, and does it call for new paradigms? And that's why what Juan talked about earlier really resonated with me, because I'm going to make a similar argument today. So I hope I stick to these 3 points in what I'm going to suggest here. So banana republicanism is this term that I'm playing with and I'm thinking about. What's interesting is when you Google this term, what actually comes up, and it is really, it's interesting, it's people being critical of the Trump administration, right? But then reifying the kind of racialized stereotypes of Central Americans, right, in criticizing Trump. So, oh, look at what's happening here in the United States. It's what actually happens over there. So that's actually interesting. I encourage you to Google it. I'm using it in a different way. I'm trying to conceptualize racial scripts that reveal long-held beliefs about Central American racial difference. And when I use racial scripts, I'll talk a little bit about the literature, but it's a kind of a synthesis of racial scripts that we're very familiar with, right? There's a lot that's nothing new, that it's been there, that it's been applied to other racialized groups. But there's also, what I'm trying to tease out is that there is another dimension there. And what I like about using racial scripts as a concept that Melina really developed in her writing is the relational piece, right? Is that thinking about racialization as just like an additive project, like, oh, we racialize this group and now we're just going to racialize you, right? Really doesn't count or account for the fact that this, racial identity and is relational, contextual, and it's always in relation to different groups in the local context. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how when you look at public discourse and practices around that discourse about who Central Americans are and the criminalization of Central Americans, there's another element there that really is about all of the ideas that really are cemented around the idea of the banana republic. This kind of, unknowable almost place, but that's what makes it so dangerous, is that it's unknowable. It's almost like, well, these folks are my enemies, but at least I know them, right? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then the third point that I'm going to make, and I'm not going to spend too much time on, but I suggest that this form of differential racialization, across different Latino groups really poses significant, it's significant for Latinx transnational political solidarities in a moment that we really need those solidarities. And it's not, we can't presume that those solidarities exist just because there's racialized discourse, right? In the 2016 elections, the idea was the Trump effect, that we were all going to interpret the message and react in similar ways, right? And so that can't be, like Cristina Beltran says, political solidarity can't be taken for granted. It's a political act. So I'm drawing on, this idea of racialization and racial scripts being a set of practices or structures that form ideas about difference. This literature, especially, when it comes to in Latino studies, has really focused on Mexican migration and Mexicans in the US, and has really made central the relationship between capital and labor as a central category of analysis. Molina and then Leo Chavez as well talks about narratives and discursive practices. And their conclusions are that these narratives, like the Latino racial threat? Is that what it's called? I just wrote a paper about it. I just talked to Roger's class this morning. It's great because it also focuses on discourse and on, popular culture and these kind of common sense beliefs about the other. And it focuses on the US-Mexico border, on invasion, biological inferiority, disease, a group being foreign, deportable, criminality, hypersexuality, birds of passage, et cetera. So these are all kind of racial scripts that we're familiar with when it comes to the Mexican experience. But I also, in looking specifically at what's the public discourse over the last few years, going back on the idea of race being relational, that the racialization of Central Americans has also sought to differentiate between Central Americans and Mexicans at key times, and that has it's a political project. It's a racial project in many ways that's very much tied to this, the vertical border, if you will. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So on the so-called caravans, the thing that struck a lot of us here in North America, and it was really interesting how in the US, how these, how the perception, right? And it's really interesting, the articles, if you look at the articles and how the stories were reported about the Tijuana mayor, I forget his name right now, but wearing the MAGA hat, right? And it was something, it wasn't MAGA, it was Mata, make Tijuana great again? Or I don't know, right? Huh? Yeah. But the signifier, right, of Mexican nationalism. And the kind of discourse that we received here in the media about the chanting and Tijuana first, long live Mexico, no more migrants, immigrants, yes, illegals, no, get out, pigs, etc. And we understand, like all the presenters here talked about, that this is not the uniform response to migrants, but it's definitely the message that we were receiving here. And it prompted me to think about banana republicanism, not only in terms of a US context,
when we think about the racialization of Central Americans and how much it's been informed by the corporate colonialism of the United States in Central America, but also in a transnational context. So these are the ideas I'm working with, and sorry if it's a little hard to read. This new PowerPoint is really overwhelming. So what I'm thinking about is banana republicanism being a set of racial scripts that are deployed and have been deployed by American corporate colonialism, reified in popular culture, about the corruption, violence, poverty, political upheavals, barbarism, and this is also really important, Jason Colby talks about it, mixed race savagery of Central Americans. And it's something that has to be controlled geopolitically. Right? That is really interesting what Juan talks about when you talk about space, because there's this idea that you can actually contain, right? The idea of containment around the quote-unquote Northern Triangle is really interesting, and the role that Mexico plays in that containment. And I think that really produces new ideas of racial difference. And I think this concept works to decenter the US-Mexico border and includes multiple borders and hierarchies within and across geographies, as well as racial groups in Central America, including indigenous communities. That makes me sound like a geographer, but I swear I'm not. I use things like space and geographies, I guess maybe I am. And this isn't like a new concept, right? I think Claudia Millán really spelled that out, or at least was aiming toward doing that in her book, Latining America, in which she says, Central American Americans disorients the binaries of white-black or white-brown to include other ethno-racial subject formations like Latin blackness, brownness, and dark brownness, end quote. So some examples now, right? Nicaragua, and the reason this is super unscientific, I just chose these randomly, right? But the idea is to really do a more systematic, for my next book, my first one's not even out, but for my next book. So Nicaragua in 1850s, I was reading about Greytown, right? And the uprising there. And this quote struck me. The president at the time, the US president says, to justify the destruction, Pierce cited the offenses committed by a heterogeneous assemblage gathered from various countries and composed for the most part of blacks and persons of mixed blood with mischievous and dangerous propensities. It was not the last time, right, that a racialized threat to US Capitol would spur Washington to imperial violence. And then you fast forward all the way to an article on Honduras. I'm teaching a class on Central America this semester, so I have these sources. This is from The Economist from 2013. This is before even the widespread media attention of the caravans. It says, violent, poor, and politically wobbly. Honduras meets most people's definition of a banana republic. Its murder rate is the highest in the world. Its economy in a pickle. Its problems are not new. The turbulent country has a dubious honor of being the place that first inspired the description, quote, banana republic more than a century ago. These narratives are difficult they're longstanding. When you think about the banana republicanism that I'm talking about, and this argument is really shared and really inspired by Lacey's work, showing the continuities around the discourse and the racialization over various administrations. This is the part that I really want to draw attention to, right? Because it's a really interesting discursive move. Reagan talked about Central Americans in this way that we are very familiar with, but it's like people with no agency, easily duped, easily manipulated, but yet that's the reason that they're the most dangerous. So you'll see here in this quote, Vice President Pence says, this caravan was organized by leftist groups in Honduras and human traffickers who have no regard for human life. The caravan is an attempt by Honduras leftists to destabilize the current regime, Newsweek 2018. And we're all familiar with Trump Jr. retweeting, the caravan contains gang members, dangerous people from the Middle East. You know what I'm saying? So it's like this sort of amalgamation. And it's, when we think about what Reagan was doing in the 80s, it wasn't even just Central Americans. It was the ways in which Central America was porous to these other forms of subversion. So Reagan's task force said that Central Americans constituted a potential fifth column of terrorism in the U.S. because extremists, i.e. communists, would, quote, feed on the anger and frustration of recent Central and South American immigrants who will not realize their version of the American dream. So even, with the accusation of being communists, like, it's not because we want to be communists, it's because other people convinced us to be communists. Abject violence and this kind of unknowability. I don't know if anybody saw the parody on SNL of Fox News covering the caravans. I don't know if anybody remembers that. If we had more time, we could watch it. But Cecily Strong's character is parodying, I don't even know which Fox News person. I don't know. And she says about the caravans, quote, everyone you've ever seen in your nightmares. It's got Guatemalans, Mexicans, ISIS, the Menendez brothers, the 1990 Detroit Pistons, Thanos, and I don't follow Marvel. Is he from Marvel? Is he a bad guy? Okay. And several Babadooks, end quote. And so, and obviously we've already talked about Trump and his, sensationalism of MS-13. But this idea of geopolitical containment around these kind of porosity, I'm good, I'm on time. And, we've seen these tweets in which when, the danger that Central American caravans represent, that's when the U.S. calls on Mexico and applauds Mexico for its role in that geopolitical containment. So this quote, MS-13 gang members are being removed by our great ICE and Border Patrol agents by the thousands, but these killers come back in from El Salvador and through Mexico like water. And Mexico's, has to do a better job. Mexico did a great job in detaining folks. Stop drugs. He's so crazy. But so I'll end with this, right? So if we take seriously the idea that the racialization of Central Americans in the current moment constitutes a new racial project that seeks to kind of distinguish groups, for politically useful purposes. If we take that very, seriously, then it has consequences, right? Because the way that we've studied racialization in the U.S. has been that shared experiences of racialization produces linked fate, like Matt Barreto and Gary Segura talk about, or that we're all racialized and we all feel as perpetual foreigners. But what we're seeing really in terms of this politically useful discourse is that even when it comes to kind of immigrant rights, there's hierarchies of belongingness and deservingness, right? And there's a lot of literature on this, good, bad, immigrant. But in the last few years, we've really seen that coded, right? In ways that really, what people are really referring to is, the dreamer versus the gang member, and the gang member, mapping onto Central American, identities. And so what I'll end with is just to say again that even though banana republicanism, really erases Central American agency, political agency, that Central American groups, and this is what I talk about in the book project that I'm working on now, have for a very long time, established a politics, a contentious politics, that rejects this kind of good, bad immigrant, narrow forms of legalization, have denounced illegality, and have claimed transnational rights outside of the framework of borders and citizenship. you know, and I was talking to some students this morning, and it had me thinking about, you know, what would citizenship be without borders, and it got me thinking, and I couldn't really answer in the moment, and then I was thinking, what we really have to be suspicious of is citizenship with borders, you know, militarized borders, because it really sort of, that's really what we have to be suspect of, you know, in the end. So thank you for that, and thank you again to the organizers. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Arely. So we now have Professor Rodolfo Casillas from the Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales, Flaxo, in Mexico City. On this, as part, you know, you have, as Cecilia and others have said, you have the bios here, but I do have to emphasize that Rodolfo is actually one of the OGs of the study of Central American migration to and through Mexico. So he's done research on this topic for decades, and of course we're very pleased with everybody who's come to the conference, all the presenters, but we are very happy to have someone who's worked for many, many decades on this topic. Adelante, Rodolfo.
Thank you. Well, thanks to the UCLA organization and all the people that made possible this conference. And a special thanks for Lacey, Cecilia, and Ruben for inviting me. And I think everybody here will be happy if I speak Spanish and not my horrible English. So, I'm going to speak in Spanish. First thing that I want to say, lo primero que tengo que thanks, you are listening me. Right. La pregunta de esta mesa es integración política y económica. ¿Y qué tipo de integración podemos tener cuando estamos viviendo tiempos en que se construye el miedo hacia la otredad social, hacia el extranjero? Estoy hablando de México, no de Estados Unidos, ¿eh? También de Estados Unidos, por supuesto, ¿no? Pero quiere decir, esta construcción no es solo en un país, es un proceso mundial y somos parte de ese proceso. Entonces, cuando nos preguntamos qué pasa con estos extranjeros centroamericanos que vienen a México, que transitan por México, que están en México, como hemos estado hablando hoy y ayer lo vimos en unas imágenes muy bien logradas en la película. ¿Quiénes se integran y para qué propósitos? ¿Qué hacen los gobiernos para que este tipo de integraciones ocurran? Yo les voy a hablar un poco sobre los centroamericanos del norte, Guatemala, Honduras y El Salvador, que residen en México en particular. Y voy a hacer referencia a otros dos flujos que son importantes en los medios y en las discusiones entre los gobiernos, como son los migrantes que transitan por México y los que solicitan refugio. En esta lámina, bueno, en la anterior que tenemos, primero quisiera hacer referencia a que aquí tenemos una diversidad de flujos. Son flujos que tienen cierta autonomía unos de otros, pero no podemos negar que hay vasos comunicantes entre unos flujos y otros en momentos determinados. Y eso hace que tenemos que hablar necesariamente de flujos mixtos. Eso es importante porque si nosotros no entendemos esa mezcla de flujos, es muy difícil desde instancias de gobierno que puedan aplicar políticas generales que no tomen en cuenta las partes específicas de cada uno de los componentes de estos flujos. Y ese es uno de los graves errores que tenemos cuando se han hablado del flujo que transita por México y no se toma en cuenta que en ese flujo vienen desde que migrantes económicos, migrantes que vienen huyendo de la violencia, vienen otros que vienen solicitando refugio, vienen otros que fueron expulsados de Estados Unidos directamente a Centroamérica y quieren regresar a Estados Unidos. Y tenemos aquellos otros que van buscando la reintegración familiar, entre otros flujos más. Entonces, vemos una composición múltiple de situaciones, de circunstancias y de propósitos en un grupo aparentemente homogéneo que viene en una caravana o en algún otro movimiento similar. Esa es la primera cosa que tenemos que tener presente. ¿Cuál es el peso de la migración históricamente hablando en México, de acuerdo a los censos y a una encuesta intercensal de 2015? Bueno, si nosotros vemos ahí el peso relativo de la población extranjera en México, no llega a ser ni siquiera el 1%. Entonces, aquellos que temen que estamos siendo invadidos, que hemos sido invadidos, las propias estadísticas del gobierno nos dan elementos para responder que no hay razón objetiva para tener este tipo de apreciación subjetiva, de intolerancia, de discriminación y de rechazo. Si no creen ustedes en las estadísticas oficiales, bueno, busquen otras, pero estas son las que usa el gobierno para muchos propósitos de sus propias políticas. Pero estamos siendo invadidos por los centroamericanos, dice esa voz alterada. Las estadísticas oficiales del gobierno de México, de la instancia más prestigiada, que es el INEGI, nos presenta en esta zona, ustedes ven las nacionalidades que nos llaman de interés, Guatemala, Honduras y El Salvador, y ven que en términos absolutos y en términos relativos es un número muy bajo. Es decir, en 2015, si sumamos las tres nacionalidades, estamos hablando de poco más de 68,000 personas en un país que tiene 120 millones de habitantes. 68,000 personas, pues, caben en la unidad familiar donde yo vivo, que es en una partecita de Coyoacán. Es decir, nada. Si pensamos que esas 68,000 personas están en todo el país, pues entonces todavía se disminuye. Y si vemos el valor relativo, ya lo anunciaba hace su momento la paisana, que aunque dice que es colombiana, pero es chapaneca, se lo ha ganado con 20 años o más de estar viviendo ahí. Es el 0.006%. Nada. Es decir, es muy poco, pero si nosotros vamos más allá, ¿y en dónde se encuentran esos 68,000? Bueno, vamos a ver algunas de esas características sociodemográficas y laborales de esta población para empezar a aterrizar un poco esa cifra mayor en cosas particulares. Bueno, aquí también un dato que ya adelantaba hace un momento Marta, ¿no? Es que hay más mujeres que hombres. Cuando el flujo, de acuerdo a la estadística oficial de los que transitan por México, son más hombres que mujeres. Pero en el caso de los residentes hay más mujeres que hombres de esos tres mismos países. Entonces empezamos a tener elementos para distinguir un flujo de otro, y eso es un insumo importante para que cuando un gobierno diseña políticas, pues tiene que tomar en cuenta que son distintos un flujo de otro, ¿verdad? Bueno, ya tenemos aquí el primer elemento de que hay más mujeres que hombres. ¿De qué edades? Bueno, aquí lo estamos viendo, si sumamos de los 19 a los 49, pues estamos hablando de un 70%. Es decir, es población, es joven, en edad reproductiva y en edad de trabajo y de estudio. ¿Qué quiere decir? Son elementos constructivos de la sociedad y los tejidos sociales, como todos ustedes que están aquí prácticamente caben en estos grupos, sabemos que somos los que están dándole oxígeno, nuevo oxígeno a la sociedad, no solo a las instituciones como tales, sino a la propia sociedad. ¿Y en dónde se encuentran? Fíjense, la mayoría están en Chiapas. Ya desde aquí, desde hace rato venimos hablando, pero los datos numéricos importan para ratificar. No están dispersos en todo el país, por una serie de razones diversas, como la cercanía que permite que vayan de un lado a otro con cierta facilidad. Y eso, ¿en qué se traduce para el gobierno? En estabilidad, en gobernabilidad, en tejidos sociales que por distintas razones está registrado en un país, trabaja en otro, y están yendo y viniendo, algunos con una periodicidad diaria, porque vienen a las plantaciones del banano, hay otros con una periodicidad mayor porque vienen a alguna zafra, algunos otros por el sector servicios donde están integrados, aunque ya me estoy adelantando a otra lámina, pero estoy hablando de tejidos sociales que son dinámicos, que son activos y que cualquier variación en la política pública puede alterar la convivencia y la cohesión y la integración social, que para efectos de gobierno, les digo, es gobernabilidad. Bueno, esta otra, que son algunos otros elementos importantes. Aunque aquí, digamos, el peso relativo de la población indígena, digamos, no es muy fuerte, yo quiero aprovechar esta circunstancia para decir públicamente que la película que ayer vimos representa muy bien esa pluralidad de naciones, de lenguas, ¿no? Que muchas veces en los datos agregados, como aparecen en las estadísticas de los estados, no se ven. Entonces, felicidades, directora, por habernos presentado ayer eso que en muchos textos académicos no se ven, porque están haciendo referencia al agregado de nación, población guatemalteca, tantos, pero no nos hablan de la pluralidad sociocultural, lingüística, que ayer lo vimos en unas cuantas láminas muy bien logradas, ¿no? Bien, también tenemos los grados de estudio. Y aquí vemos que la mayoría de la población tiene niveles mínimos de estudio. ¿Y por qué es importante esto? Porque mientras los liberales mexicanos del siglo XIX y del siglo XX, y lo vemos en el conjunto de disposiciones legales de toda esa época, pensaron en que llegaran a México hombres blancos, industriosos, con capital y tecnología, ¿no? Por lo regular estaban pensando que venían de Inglaterra, ciertamente de Estados Unidos, con digamos, un debate interno entre aquellos en México que querían que vinieran de preferencia españoles, porque aparte de que hablaban español, eran católicos, ¿no? Y entonces iban a reforzar un tipo de identidad, frente a aquellos otros que decían no, que vengan los industriosos, aunque hablen inglés, y a lo mejor vienen hasta protestantes, pero lo importante es que la economía funcione, ¿no? El progreso. Y que en sentido ordinario se tradujo en la invitación hay que mejorar la raza, ¿no? ¿Y qué era? Había que buscarse a un güerito o a una güerita para ser pareja y mejorar la raza. Eso lo bajo de esos enunciados éticos más amplios a una práctica muy concreta de cómo hacer que la sociedad mejorara. ¿Y qué es lo que nos da la realidad en todos los censos? Pues que esa población deseada realmente en términos numéricos nunca llegó a México ni en el siglo XIX, ni en el XX, ni en lo que va del XXI. Y nos está llegando población de Centroamérica con las características que estamos viendo. Por eso esto rompe un paradigma que se ha venido construyendo a lo largo del tiempo, ¿no? Y por eso las políticas públicas muchas veces tienen esa contradicción entre lo que se desea y lo que realmente es. Y eso también alimenta las intolerancias, porque nos está llegando lo que no queremos. ¿Qué actividades tenemos? Bueno, para empezar, aquí, si vemos, la mayoría de los residentes, ¿lo vemos? Es población que está empleada. Entonces también tenemos un elemento importante. No son gente que está, como se ha descalificado de manera constante, gente holgazana. ¿En qué está? ¿En qué actividades se dedican? Fíjense, es importante ir viendo cómo hay una evolución dentro de un mismo flujo. Como las sociedades también evolucionan. Nosotros venimos de sociedades rurales a sociedades cada vez más citadinas. Y eso también se ve en el flujo. Aquí, aunque tengamos una referencia muy corta en el tiempo, ¿no? La población que llegaba en los años 90 tenía más presencia en el sector primario. La que tenemos del 2015 ya está más en el sector servicios. Es decir, a pesar de las bajas calificaciones, ya que hay muchos elementos para descalificar en un sentido, también tenemos cambios cualitativos en esos mismos sectores de baja capacitación y estudio. Entonces ahí tenemos un dato importante y la gráfica que está ahí al final es una manera como desde las estadísticas oficiales se registra esa mano de obra que tenemos en el sureste mexicano, ¿no? Hay otras maneras. Los empleados de las fincas anotan el dato del que, en las fincas de café, por ejemplo, del que está al frente de la familia que está cosechando el café. Y esa es otra estadística. Y la mejor estadística que yo me encontré y se las comparto, ¿no? Es la estadística de la cocina. ¿Por qué? Porque todo el mundo come tortilla. Y a cada trabajador le apartan 8 o 10 tortillas. Entonces, si uno cuenta el número de apartados de 10 tortillas, uno sabe el total de la mano de obra realmente trabajando en la finca, cuando las otras dos estadísticas nos dan registros distintos. Entonces tenemos 3 fuentes de información estadística. Ustedes pueden elegir la que más les guste. Tenemos otros datos. Esto no simplemente lo quiero presentar rápidamente porque el tiempo se agota, ¿no? En que cómo ha venido evolucionando en lo que va del siglo XX la presentación de solicitudes, y simplemente también para decir que aparte de que hay un crecimiento realmente significativo en cuanto a la trayectoria de lo que teníamos en 2000, que eran 277 solicitudes en todo el año a una instancia federal, es decir, nada, no había ni siquiera una en promedio por día. Llegamos a una cifra significativa en los últimos tiempos. Pero lo más importante, cada vez se abre más la brecha entre la cantidad de quienes solicitan refugio de la cantidad que sí se le da el refugio. ¿Qué hacen los que no son aceptados? Por desistimiento, como quieran, engrosan el flujo, otro flujo. Por eso los flujos mixtos también son alimentados por decisiones del gobierno que nada más los pasa de esta ventanilla de solicitantes de refugio a aquellos que pueden ser migrantes en tránsito para otro destino. Estas son las principales nacionalidades. Estamos viendo que son las 3 de Centroamérica y venezolanos, que lo voy a retomar después si hay preguntas porque el tiempo se agota y no quiero apartarme del buen comportamiento de todos quienes me precedieron previamente en respetar el tiempo disponible, ¿no? Esto también, la evolución para los migrantes en tránsito, y unas conclusiones muy rápidas. La primera que tenemos que ver es, primero, la población extranjera en México tiene un número absoluto y relativo muy bajo. Segundo, los países centroamericanos representan una milésima fracción de punto en el total, ¿no? Están ubicados en el sureste, más en Chiapas, en actividades en servicios, ¿no? Tienen vasos comunicantes con otros flujos, ¿no? Y es un número tan bajo que que incluso con las caravanas y los números recientes de solicitantes, el año pasado fueron 66,000 solicitudes, aunque México diera la sorpresa y aceptara todas las solicitudes, el 100%, hay capacidad social, territorial y en muchos sentidos para absorberlos. Hay otras disposiciones que no responden a la lógica migratoria. Las políticas del miedo, las políticas de las divisiones y sobre todo de la selección con quién queremos integrarnos y con quién no, que cada vez muestra que todo lo que traemos del siglo XIX al presente cada vez son más anacrónicas y si queremos ser parte del siglo XXI tenemos que ir cambiando para empezar nuestra propia mentalidad. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Gracias, Rodolfo. Thank you. So we have a few minutes, thanks to my dictatorial control of time. We have a few minutes to for questions for the presenters. We have, if the presenters can maybe come to the Juan and Areli, please, right here. So, all right, guys, fire away. Any questions for our panelists?
Muchas gracias a todos por las exposiciones, me conmovieron mucho, pero en especial quiero compartir con Areli que un fenómeno como el que nos estamos espejeando, me parece muy interesante, digamos, las categorías que propones para esa heterorrepresentación en clave deteriorada, ¿no? Porque lo que se produce en México, en tanto que estudiamos las diásporas y las transmigraciones desde las narrativas blanqueadas y del norte, es que se cayó en una trampa epistemológica muy, digamos, que yo creo que es una coproducción de brokers narrativos, pero también de académicos y académicas y de más media, que hay de, digamos, del neoliberalismo para acá una asociación entre joven y mara. Lo que se generaliza en la noción de que todos los centroamericanos son maras, a lo que le llamamos la maratización de digamos, de la población centroamericana. Y tiene dos efectos más complejos y dolorosos. Y esto lo voy a decir con todo el respeto, porque yo respeto esa estrategia de performatividad, porque es pragmática, y si con eso, si tú crees que esto es transparente y con eso me das crédito, hay una performatividad de los pocos demandantes de asilo en una franja etaria en la que hacen eco de esa maratización, autobasurizando su existencia. Y a mí eso es me preocupa más eso que lo que piense la opinión pública. La autorrepresentación que tenemos de nosotras mismas. Y luego yo creo, o sea, de veras valoro un montón la propuesta y creo que hay que soltarla y hay que contaminarla y hay que cantarla en MAM, hay que cantarla en tzotzil, hay que cantarla en castellano, porque nosotros somos bellas y nuestra existencia se tiene que celebrar, ¿no? Y hay que revertir esos discursos que nos basurizan. Entonces agradezco profundamente a las dos, porque las dos me dieron pistas y digamos, me emociona profundamente escucharlos, pero hay que contaminar las discusiones de la Academia Whitezican, compañeras así en concreto, porque no, digamos, ocurren otras narrativas, ¿sí?
Other questions, comments, reactions?
Hi, I wanted to say thank you, all three panelists. This was amazing. I thought I was going to need coffee to get through this afternoon session, but you guys did great. So I've actually done work on Central American and Southeast Asian settlement in Orange County and like space mixing practices over there. And it's a place with like a very particular image in the popular imagination, just like Oakland, like Los Angeles, of course, radically different from both of those places. And places that I like studied were like restaurants and strip malls as places of identity formation and also places for informal networks of support. A place that I didn't get to study and something that I think would be a really beautiful place for all of you to explore is like youth and youth spaces, like high schools. Because right now the big discourse in like on Twitter for youth is like Latinx versus Latin American. And so Latinx youth who are growing up kind of away from their parents' places of origins are in these like spaces or youth spaces like having this experience of like relational racialization. So I wondered if any of you have anything to speak to that point and how you're thinking through specifically like youth or immigrant youth and how they're being racialized in a place like the US.
Thank you for the comment, both of you, actually. I think, just to reiterate your comment, me and the compa over there, Steven, we're talking about this right after the talk, which is two things you have to take into account when you're talking about race and racialization, which is not only the meta-narrative, but also the ways in which these things are internalized and reproduced, on the, micro level. And I think that's absolutely true. And in speaking to your point, I want to give a shout out to Unica and to the origins of Unica. I have my sweatshirt finally. I finally got my sweatshirt, Unica sweatshirt, because it's an example of youth. And I'm not saying that, I'm not saying that this is, but these are examples, right? When Useo, I think it was maybe, now we're in 2020, so 10 years ago? I don't know. These youth were just starting out, right, in organizing themselves. And they rejected the kind of criminal, that the idea, so, because what happens, right, when you have these kinds of racial scripts, and Latinos, even Latino scholars have responded in a way in sort of these assimilationist frameworks, that that's not who we are. Like, even in our campaigns today about Here is Home and TPS, right, it's like,
We're not gang members. Like, we're not terrorists. Like, that's not who the majority of us are. And those are very dangerous traps to fall into, and I do, that's why I give a shout out to Useo, because if you can imagine, these were youth, these were young people who all of a sudden had the spotlight on them about what they were doing, and the discourse and many Central American elites wanted to say, oh, look, let's hold these youth up as a shining example of college-going aspirational youth. And their political commitment, and I also shout out to the committed, la generación, comprometida, which the politics comes from that, that they rejected that space, and they could have been like, yeah, this is who we are, we're these aspirational youth, and they rejected that. So I do find these really important spaces that we need to learn from. And that's, for me, in the last 10 years, it's been undocumented and immigrant youth who have really inspired me and given me a new perspective, not only on my politics, but also on the politics of the Central American communities. So that's why.
Yeah. Thank you for the question about youth. I think it's something that I've been trying to write more about it because I'm writing this book on the Chicano movement. Is that, well, these were youth, right? I often tell my undergrads that people that built free health clinics that I study or free legal centers were like 18, 19-year-olds that like got things together and worked with community, but also to like excavate the history of solidarity movements that have worked through many communities here in the United States. So in Oakland, where I study, people were, these youth that were activists, right? They were forming a lot of global solidarity movements that I think we can take a lot of inspiration from. And then, especially when we think about divisions between sort of Chicanos and Central Americans. And what I've uncovered is that there's so much of this third world thinking that comes out of the 1960s, that especially in Oakland Bay Area, they were really aligned with the Cuban Revolution. They were involved with the study of Marxism across the globe, and they were really active in Central America, especially with the Nicaraguan Revolution. And so if you follow some of these activists that were youth, and as they become adults, they're the ones who are helping with the solidarity movement for Central Americans in the 80s, or they're the ones who are also sort of going out there and helping folks in Chiapas now. And so I feel like it's important to tell those stories of cross-racial alliances and solidarity movements that I think have happened here in the United States for a long time.
Other questions, comments? Yes.
Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful presentations. I had a question for Arely. How do you conceptualize racial formation and racial scripts from the Central American context influencing this banana republicanism?
I'm like, that's what I'm having trouble with. No. So how do I conceptualize it through the idea of banana republic? This is what, I think for me, the idea of, a banana republic or a failed state is really sort of a racialized concept, right? Again, citing my compañero over there, Stephen, that if you think about, that the U.S. isn't called a failed state, right? And in many ways, you could make that argument right now. But also, but I think what I want to tease out more, and I don't have a full answer for you, but what I want to tease out more is how a concept that we've come to understand as talking about a state really also reflects on the ways in we think about a people, right? And a people that are not capable of self-rule and self-government, that are not deserving of sovereignty and self-determination. And obviously that very much has to do with, indigeneity and what Flori earlier talked about in terms of the racial question in Central America. So that's what I have to tease out, right? And the only way to do that is, depending on, you could look at, the criminalization and racialization of gangs and youth, or you could look at pop culture. You could look at, like Lacey Abrego does a great job of tracing kind of pop culture elements. And I think all of those, that's the work that has yet to be done, but I'm thinking, the reason I'm thinking through that concept is because I really want to show that this has been a long-standing, this is central to American culture, the differentiation, who Americans were banana eating, right? Coffee sipping, I've seen the ads, the banana, and the differentiation between us and them, but that's what I want to tease out, the cultural element of what a banana republic meant, and how that banana republicanism has now, we couldn't contain it. Now it has seeped in here. And that's why we now refer to there's all these critical pieces online now when we want to criticize Trump, it's saying, oh, look at his banana republicanism, So it's a very interesting kind of what Stephen Osuna over there calls the specter of neoliberalism in his upcoming article. Shout out. Come up here, Stephen.
All right. Yes.
One last thing that I wanted to comment is what I see then very parallel here are all the rhetoric from the Cold War rhetoric that is again repeating in. And if we see then the people who migrate, those movements of solidarity that there were before and supported certain Marxist tendencies, etc., when those immigrants came here, they were really afraid to talk about that because they were persecuted for this on their side. So how that form of integration and is something that I only wanted to put in the air. how that influence integration, but also shapes the rhetoric in other countries, as in Mexico as well. So how this rhetoric of being more westernized and adapting all this rhetoric for ourselves becomes also part of the narratives going into the South.
You want to take that on?
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a great comment, yeah.
No, it's
So-
true. Yeah, that's what's really come out of this conversation, for sure.
I actually have a question for Rodolfo, so I'm going to take advantage of holding the mic. Rodolfo, vimos en las láminas que presentaste un cambio en un periodo de menos de 30 años, ¿no? Un cambio radical, se podría decir, ¿no? De la salida de esta mano de obra de los trabajadores, de los migrantes centroamericanos de la agricultura y su paso al sector servicios. Te pediría que si pudieras abundar un poco más sobre qué factores, escuchamos ya algo a lo largo del día, pero qué factores explican esta transformación tan dramática de la inserción laboral de los migrantes centroamericanos.
Bueno, siempre en estos procesos sociales hay causas múltiples que se combinan y no siempre, digamos, las vemos así. Ya en la mañana Marta había comentado cómo se había depreciado el valor de la mano de obra en el sector agrícola. La caída del precio del café, por ejemplo, es algo que golpea mucho. Y no obstante, sigue habiendo una presencia constante de trabajadores guatemaltecos que son los que levantan la cosecha en el Soconusco en particular. Pero por otro lado también tenemos procesos de, digamos, de desarrollo económico regional diferenciado. Y aparte de los procesos de globalización, les doy un dato. En los años de la década perdida, que se le habló de América Latina, era cuando yo empezaba a ir a Chiapas en los años 80, y mientras muchas partes de la economía de México sufrían por la situación, Tapachula empezó a cambiar. Como otras ciudades de México empezaron a cambiar, pero no porque hubiera una mejora en la economía, sino porque los narcos se cambiaron, por ejemplo, de Sinaloa, se fueron a mi tierra natal, a Guadalajara, y empezaron a abrir sectores o negocios para lavar su dinero, ¿no? Y lo que pasa en Tapachula, si ustedes van a Tapachula hoy, van a encontrar en la ciudad que hay muchas casas no solo de cambio, sino de empeño de valores, ¿no? Y uno puede decir, ¿por qué la gente, qué empeñan? Bueno, es que hay muchos migrantes que a veces van y van vendiendo prendas, ¿no? Y alguien tenía que hacer eso, ¿no? En los años 80, cuando yo iba, tenía que ir a una tiendita que era la casa de cambio de valores, disfrazada, porque no era su negocio era vender cigarros, dulces y demás. Pero empezó a crecer la demanda de quienes iban a cambiar pesos por quetzales o quetzales por pesos, ¿sí? Y entonces se empezó a diversificar el mercado. Es decir, hubo un crecimiento del sector servicios. Si ustedes van a Tapachula hoy, van a ver una tienda de Costco, Sam's, ¿no? Ahí. Y se dice, ¿y esto en este lugar? Sí, pero si ven su ubicación, está muy cerca del periférico para que rápidamente los lleve a Guatemala, ¿no? Entonces, vemos cómo el capitalismo nunca se desarrolla de manera igual, ¿no? De manera diferenciada por regiones y por actividades. Bueno, eso nos ayuda, por eso decía que era algo que también hablaba un poco Carmen de los procesos complejos. En esa complejidad tenemos algunos precios que se abaratan y nos castiga la mano de obra, sí, pero luego tenemos una ampliación del mercado de servicios, ¿no? Diversos, y tenemos procesos de globalización, ¿no? Y tenemos que para pagar el rescate, pues se necesita de Western Union, de la economía formal, para pagar una actividad ilegal, como es el secuestro. Sí, pero usamos la economía formal. Y lo mandamos de Estados Unidos para que llegue a un lugar de Tapachula. Sí, pero entonces pasamos de la globalización a un efecto local. Entonces empezamos a ver una serie de transferencias en donde vemos que lo formal y lo informal se complementan. Perdón que me haya extendido un poquito, pero ahí es donde tenemos que recurrir a esos elementos más amplios para ver los efectos locales de las aldeas globales.
We have time for one more question, perhaps, one or two more questions.
En sus cifras también mostró que en las solicitudes de refugio de venezolanos y prometió ampliar si queríamos un poquito más. Mi tema de trabajo es la migración colombo-venezolana y me gustaría que hiciera una pequeña lectura de cómo está el tema de los venezolanos en México.
Sí. Bueno, gracias. El crecimiento de solicitudes de venezolanos, sabemos un poco la razón, ¿no? Pero también tenemos que contextualizar el proceso de México con lo que pasa en la región. Es decir, vimos en las cifras ahí, tenemos un crecimiento significativo, de que antes en el año 2000 ni siquiera había uno solo, y ahora de repente tenemos 6,000, ¿no? Entonces, si hacemos una lectura estrictamente apegada al dato, tenemos un crecimiento exponencial insólito en toda la historia. Sí, eso es cierto. Pero también si vemos que en el caso de los hondureños, que tienen cifras mayores de solicitudes, ¿a quién le responde México, el gobierno de México, positivamente? Bueno, durante la administración de Peña Nieto, al final de la administración de Peña Nieto, en donde ya había una posición en contra de Maduro, diferente a la que el mismo gobierno tuvo al inicio de su gestión, ¿no? Por razones, digamos, estrictamente políticas, aunque el número de solicitantes venezolanos era menor que al de hondureños, le dieron más aceptación a los venezolanos que a los hondureños. Pero había otra razón. ¿Cuáles son las características de esos venezolanos frente a los hondureños? Es clase media, medios güeritos, café con leche, con más leche que café, ¿no? ¿No? Y que se vienen a insertar en un sector que también le interesa a las formas tradicionales de. En cambio, los hondureños, ¿cómo eran? ¿No? Unas hipotas allí, que, perdón, pues no, porque además en las viejas ideas, muchas de estas mujeres son robamaridos, ¿no? Bueno, ¿no? Les ganaron, pero, ¿no? Sí. Bueno, entonces tenemos ahí, pero si vemos otra dimensión y ampliamos un poquito la mirada, en la tierra natal de doña Marta, acá presente, ¿no? También tenemos poco más de 40 millones de habitantes y tienen 2 millones de venezolanos. Bueno, en México no llegan a ser ni siquiera 8,000 solicitantes de refugio. Entonces, ¿cuál es el peso relativo? Perú tiene 800,000. Y si empezamos a ver, entonces no nos olvidemos del mundo, de nuestras regiones, para ver los pesos relativos, para no permitir que el miedo a la otredad social se nos salga de control, ¿no? Y acuérdense, lo diferente nos enriquece, ¿no? Los Ángeles es una ciudad rica porque es una pequeña representación de las naciones del mundo, ¿no? Bueno, también tenemos muchos sitios, entonces nosotros tenemos que ayudar a leer el mundo de una manera diferente, porque si no, nosotros somos cómplices de la simplificación y de la intolerancia social.